For the first time in a few weeks, I'm back to working alone, although I will have some company from a faithful friend for a couple of days. And my big focus is going to be back on the outside walls, where I'm going to be on a bit of a mission to see how much I can repoint when it's just me doing the mixing, shifting, lifting and cleaning. And to help with the repointing challenge, on Monday morning I visited the hardware store for some extra buckets and trays, although that was only after a visit to the garage to organise some car maintenance, so it was a bit of a later start than usual. And the first task was to make sure I had enough water ready for the week, and while the deposits filled, I moved on to some ground levelling for some scaffolding, which would involve a bit more digging than I had anticipated and without some of my preferred tools on site. So the shovel and then spade would be getting a bit more action than planned. With the water filling complete, the attention was fully on the scaffolding and some breaking up of a bit of bedrock to help me get things level. I was putting up this scaffolding at the front to give myself some potentially shaded workstation options during the week. And with this wall definitely not in the shade, I was in need of a drink. Before I could finish the upper levels, and then with enough platforms in place, it was time for a proper break and a late lunch. Then it was time for a different scaffold option on a different wall, this time putting my own roller unit onto the back wall. There are a few butterflies still around, but these white admirals were the only ones I had the time to capture on film this week. And then, having not used this scaffolding for a while, I had to remind myself how to put it up. Then it was time for some precautionary fencing. Before I finished up for the day to return to the garage with my car. On Tuesday, I was back at the garage first thing, and then later in the morning, I was back on site with an old friend who was keen to check on how the work has been progressing in his absence. So after a brief tour, we set up Billy's indoor base, which he seemed happy enough with. And then I was out for my first mortar mix of the week, which, although it would be a good mix, quite a lot of it would end up on me when my haste got the better of me. In fact, covering myself in mortar or water would be a bit of an ongoing theme at the start of the week. With the mortar and scaffold ready, I decided lunch for Billy and I would be best at that moment. Before heading back to start the main mission for the week, with some initial chipping out of some stone joints, covering the walls and myself with water, and then eventually starting the mortar work. With the site manager on watch from below. Satisfied with the quality of the first section of the wall, I think Billy decided to return to his cooler indoor space as I adjusted scaffolding for the next section, which, with the sun now directly on the wall, was providing enough shade that I decided I could probably work on this wall throughout the whole day this week without having to switch to the front for some shade. All the work sessions for this week would be pretty much based on mortar availability, and after the late start to the day, there was no time for a second barrow, so the work would be finishing when the last bucket was empty. With no garage visits on Wednesday morning, Billy and I were back on site at a slightly earlier time so that I could get in a full day of repointing and see just how much I could actually get done. And after setting up Billy, I was out for a first mix, which would be only slightly less messy than the day before. And then it was water time and the challenge of controlling the hose while switching on the pump and running backwards and forwards. In this instance, my hose twist proved too effective and the connector between two hose sections popped out. and then I could eventually get repointing. And having worked my way through one barrow, it was time for a lunch break once I had mixed a next barrow load. After a more successful watering of the wall, it was time for a big afternoon session of repointing, with Billy back at his outdoor watching area. He was with me for these 2 days because Laura was away from home, and we had decided that me looking after Billy and the puppy on site would be a challenge too far. So the puppy, who I hope to introduce soon, had gone with Laura. With the mortar used up, a long afternoon session came to an end. And after closing up, it was time for an end-of-day drink, water for Billy, and a non-alcoholic beer for me. With a reasonably early start and Billy back at home, Thursday would give me the chance to see how much I could really get done in a day. And I was quick to get set up and mixing without making too much mess. And once at the back, it was time for the water phase, which after an unidentified block would end up being messier and more hectic than planned. And then the morning session of repointing could start. Slightly earlier than the previous days, I was on to the second mix and lunch. And then back for the afternoon session, when keeping the mortar moist and usable would be the only real distraction for the much repeated cycle of filling the joints, smoothing out the mortar, wire brushing off the excess, and then soft brushing the surface. After 2.5 hard days of repointing on Friday, I was still excited to get back to it and see if I could get up to the halfway point on the wall and the filled in section of the old drain. And with the cleanest mix to date and the least troublesome waterwork, I got off to a good start. After making good progress in the morning, I was able to start mixing the next batch while still working on the wall, and then finish it off after a later than usual mid-morning break. Then I was back to work with the final barrow of mortar for the week, which, because I had mixed it earlier than usual, would cause some extra work later on as I try to keep it moist and smooth. I'm out of mortar and I'm out of time. So that is the end of work for this week. And while I've pushed pretty hard today and I had a couple of very big sessions, I haven't quite finished what I wanted to, that little patch down there. But next week, I'm going to finish it all and then give it the brushing and acid finishing to hopefully be able to show you a beautifully transformed wall. So please do tune in again next week to see how it looks then.